Do you hold down a job? Have you ever worked? If not already, someday you will probably be part of the labor force, the men and women between the ages of 16 and 64 who perform a service and earn wages. The labor force in America now claims nearly 80 million workers. Almost 1/4 of them belong to some group or union. What do unions do? How did they grow? And where are they headed?
Would you have freedom from wage slavery? Then join in the grand industrial band. Would you from misery and hunger be free? Then come do your share like a man. There is power in the band of working men when they stand hand in hand. That's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grand.
The labor force in the United States is a complex and many-faceted body. Workers come from many backgrounds. They perform vastly different services in vastly different fields, and they have widely divergent needs and ambitions. But for the most part, workers agree. They want the best possible working conditions and the highest possible wages. For these reasons, many of them belong to unions. Today, unions are a familiar and powerful element in American society, a recognized social, economic, and political force. But this was not always so. Early America had little organized labor. Small businesses and individually owned shops allowed a personal relationship between workers and owners. Outside the towns, farms and rural communities formed the backbone of the still undeveloped nation. With the industrial boom and growth of cities during the early 1800s, the labor scene changed drastically. New factories demanded thousands of additional workers. Many owners amassed personal fortunes, but little concern was shown for labor conditions. As a result, many workers took home only meager paychecks after a 12 to 16-hour day. In the immense, impersonal plants, individual employees were unable to confront the owners with complaints. Secretly at first, and in fear, many workers began to organize into groups or unions to gain the power to deal more successfully with their employers. Mostly, they organized with workers in the same craft or trade, banding together in craft unions. For instance, all railway conductors, or all carpenters, or all cigar makers would belong to the same union. The first task of the unions was gaining recognition from reluctant employers, the right to represent the workers and speak for them. They wanted to sit down with their employers and bargain for a contract governing the conditions under which they would then work. Their main demands in this collective bargaining process were simple: better working conditions and higher wages. The strongest weapon used to gain these demands was the strike. In 1860, shoemakers in Lynn, Massachusetts, mostly women, struck or walked off the job, ceasing production in the plant. Violence sometimes erupted, as employers still refused to give any ground to the workers. But the main purpose of the strikes was simple: putting enough pressure on an employer to force him to meet union demands. To get his operations running again, an owner might compromise with the workers and raise their salaries. In the early years, employers had their own means of combating strikes. Frequently, they hired outsiders, whom union members called scabs, to replace the strikers. One common tactic was to hire new immigrants at the docks. These newcomers, ignorant of the English language and of labor conditions, provided a cheap source of workers. As a result, factories often continued to operate despite a strike. As labor saw it in a contemporary cartoon, the owner, the capitalist, could sit back sipping his brandy, while the striker sank deeper into poverty, out of a job and out of money. By the late 1800s, however, workers saw the value in these idealistic unions and were less afraid to join. As the demand for better conditions became more widespread, the labor movement took root, and workers sought a national unity to deal with management more effectively. Many unions joined together in national federations. The most successful was the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, founded in 1886. Its first president was Samuel Gompers, a cigar maker who believed in unions organized along craft or trade lines. Gompers allowed individual unions within the AFL to retain their autonomy. They alone, he felt, were best qualified to make decisions about collective bargaining and strikes in specific situations. The attempt to establish union recognition at that time led to more clashes. Some owners remained inflexible. Workers grew in strength. The struggle erupted in bitter confrontations and full-scale riots. The roster of labor's battlefields was long and bloody. The Pullman Company in Chicago. The Carnegie Steel Mills in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Hundreds injured, many killed. And as more workers organized, they began to fight for better conditions and higher wages, to combat the filth and oppression of the sweatshops, to counter the demands of some employers. Along with the movement came a flood of new songs to reflect the workers' feelings.
We will sing one song of the children in the mills. They're taken from playgrounds and schools. In tender years, made to go the pace that kills, in the sweatshops midst the looms and the spools. Organize, oh toilers, come organize your might. Then we'll sing one song of the workers' commonwealth, full of beauty, full of love and health.
The new mass production factories seemed to call for a new kind of union. To many, the old craft union did not seem strong enough to cover unorganized workers in the steel, coal, and automobile industries. Eugene V. Debs was an early promoter of the industrial union, the union organized along industry lines. In this type of union, all railroad workers, for instance, would be grouped together, no matter what their individual skills. John L. Lewis, president of the United Mine Workers, also favored these vertical unions that cut across craft lines and organized on an industry basis. This concept was not favored by AFL leaders like President William Greene, and it caused violent dissent among the members. But at the 1935 AFL convention, Lewis made his point. He took the floor in an argument and wound up taking away much of the AFL's membership. Lewis's followers formed their own federation, now called the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. The CIO began a membership drive among big industries that made headlines across the country and inspired new workers' songs.
Now, if you want higher wages, let me tell you what to do. You got to talk to the workers in the shop with you. You got to build you a union, got to make it strong. But if you all stick together, boys, 'twon't be long. You get shorter hours, better working conditions, vacations with pay, take your kids to the seashore.
At factories where employers refused to acknowledge the union, any union, there was violence. Armed troops, tear gas, destruction of property by strikers, and jail. The most dramatic confrontations came within the auto industry. Auto workers fought hard to organize, staging sit-downs and walkouts. Owners considered these illegal seizures of property. But to the workers, they sometimes inspired joyous song fests.
When the boss don't talk, don't take a walk. Sit down, sit down. When the boss sees that, he'll want to chat. Sit down, sit down. Sit down, just take a seat. Sit down and rest your feet. Sit down, you've got a beat. Sit it down.
Under the leadership of Walter Reuther, a young industrial unionist, the auto workers held on. They won their point on February 11th, 1937. General Motors signed an agreement recognizing the United Automobile Workers as bargaining agent for its employees. This turning point in labor history was followed by other successful drives. As steel workers, clothing workers, maritime workers all gained recognition. For the next few years, the CIO's membership swelled fantastically. Hand in hand with the growth of industry, the industrial union took its place in American life. But the CIO suffered a setback during those important early years. After a brief courtship with left-wingers, John L. Lewis found his federation heavily influenced by communists. To get rid of them, the CIO wound up expelling 1/5 of its total membership by 1950. The communist threat was removed. But the shortage of members became a new problem. The CIO's rival, the AFL, was still strong. Clashes over each group's jurisdiction seemed to weaken the movement. Could not the two federations, by combining their memberships, be even more powerful if they could rejoin ranks? George Meany, elected AFL president in 1952, thought so. And so did Walter Reuther, president of the CIO. After 3 years of negotiations, they succeeded in getting together. In 1955, the AFL and CIO merged into a 16 million member federation, the largest affiliation of labor in the free world. The effect of this merger was more psychological than actual. True, the coalition of so many workers did give labor a kind of unified voice. But individual unions still retained their autonomy, the power to bargain, the power to strike. The AFL-CIO depended on the strength of its individual member unions. The rapid growth and power of the newly merged unions led to a problem that had plagued them, in varying degrees, for years: charges of corruption and racketeering. As a result of charges against James Hoffa, his union, the Teamsters, was suspended from the AFL-CIO in 1957. This event, by no means the only charge against the labor movement to date, was at least the most dramatic. These years also saw a change in the attitude of the federal government. Earlier, the government had been a restraining influence on union demands. As a contemporary cartoonist saw it, management, like the owners of a Lawrence, Massachusetts textile mill, had legal means to oppose unions. The government often helped thwart labor desires by obtaining injunctions, court orders to stop specific actions on the grounds that they were illegal. These were sometimes followed by violent clashes between strikers and police, the call-up of federal troops to quell strikers. But as urban and industrial society grew during the early 1900s, the government also grew more favorably disposed towards laborers. The Norris-LaGuardia Act of 1932 took the job of strike settlement away from the government and put it with the parties themselves by severely restricting the use of injunctions. Following a severe depression which made millions jobless, the government entered a new era of labor legislation with the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt as president. The most direct support of organized labor came in 1935 with the National Labor Relations Act, also called the Wagner Act. The Wagner Act guaranteed all workers the right to join a union of their choice, and it encouraged the practice of collective bargaining. It set up the National Labor Relations Board, an independent agency which works to encourage employers and union representatives to maintain good relations and to bargain in good faith. Local offices of the NLRB conduct secret ballot elections to let workers determine whether they want a union to represent them in collective bargaining. And the NLRB investigates complaints of unfair labor practices. 5 board members, including the chairman, maintain a national headquarters in Washington, D.C. Unfair labor practices may be filed by anyone, employer, employee, or union, at one of the NLRB's 31 regional offices. A hearing may be held to settle the issues raised, after representatives have investigated and probed every detail of the case. Ultimately, it may also be heard at the board headquarters, so that the matter can be settled fairly for all concerned. With the rights of organized labor thus secured, an amendment to the Wagner Act was passed to safeguard the rights of employers. The Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 was designed to limit the power of labor. By then, there were almost 14 million union members. As a result of Taft-Hartley, unions had to bargain with employers before a strike. The company and the union could no longer have a closed shop provision, requiring membership as a precedent to hiring. They were permitted, however, to have a union shop, which may require membership in the union as a condition of employment after 30 days of employment. And the President of the United States was empowered to call off a strike in the event of a national emergency. Major labor legislation to prevent and eliminate improper labor or management practices was the Landrum-Griffin Act of 1959. This was also aimed at protecting the civil rights of union members, setting up a Bill of Rights to guard against communist infiltration and racketeering. Landrum-Griffin also requires unions to file reports of their income and spending annually with the Secretary of Labor. The unions, struggling long and hard to gain recognition, have come a long way. Today, organized labor enjoys a prominent place in American life. But how has it changed? After 150 years of fighting for its rights, how does it use these rights? Part 2 of this program will take a closer look at labor today, its power, its activities, its impact on society.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
The union is behind us, we shall not be moved. The union is behind us, we shall not be moved. Just like a tree that's standing by the water, we shall not be moved.
The ability to be able to strike is absolutely necessary, not only in the interest of the particular workers, but more importantly, in keeping in existence in our society here in the United States a balance wheel.
I think today there is virtually no justification for a strike whatsoever.
The strike is organized labor's oldest weapon. For nearly 150 years, working men have, from time to time, chosen to walk off the job in protest. It began with early labor leaders like Samuel Gompers as a tactic to gain human rights in inhuman plants and mills. It began as the only hope of a weak and downtrodden body of workers. Today, the American labor movement has some 18 million members. They receive the highest wages in the world. But they continue to ask for increases beyond the bread and butter needs of the past. And they continue to strike. To much of the general public, the ones caught in the middle and inconvenienced, this tactic, the strike, with its subsequent loss of money, goods, and services, is the most controversial aspect of unions. Take a strike of sanitation workers in New York City. Uncollected garbage lay in the streets for a week. New Yorkers waded through a sea of trash that became a spawning ground for rats and filth. Mayor John Lindsay proclaimed a state of emergency. This strike, like most others, was based on the expiration of a contract and the union's demand for higher wages. Did it have to end in a strike? To find out what leads to a strike, and to examine the American labor movement today, we spoke with three representative leaders. Joseph Byrne is president of the Communications Workers of America, a union which includes telephone and telegraph workers. Everett Goulard, vice president in charge of industrial relations at Pan American World Airways, has had considerable experience in actual negotiations as a management representative. And Theodore Kiel is perhaps the country's best-known mediator of labor management disputes. Mr. Kiel first explains what happens when a labor contract expires.
You have the unions seeking to increase or improve the wages and conditions, and the management to keep itself in an efficient and competitive position. Now, if there is some way in which both objectives can be achieved, then there is the basis for agreement.
Joseph Byrne explains the union's preparations for the negotiations.
Every union leader I've ever met shares the concept that we are but the vehicle and the voice of the people who are dues-paying members of the union. And when they tell us what they want, we translate their expressed desires with the sophistication of the professional. In other words, we take that naked expression, I want more money, which is what you're apt to hear a member say. I need $5 a week, $10 a week, $20 a week more than I'm now getting.
If management's offer, also well prepared in advance, does not coincide with union demands, negotiations drag on. Sometimes both parties may call in a mediator, a go-between who acts as a friend of both sides to help them reach an agreement. Mediator Kiel explains what happens when the time comes to actually bargain or trade issues.
Now, this, of course, is the most sensitive period in the negotiations, and it is generally conducted by the parties against the clock for very obvious reasons. People wait as long as they can to get the best deal. But in representative bargaining, where somebody may say, well, you should have tried harder, and you had the time in which to do it, the tendency of the negotiators to wait till the end is very great.
No, I don't believe that is true. I must disagree with Mr. Kiel on that. I think many managements consciously put forth their best foot and stick to it pretty much during the entire negotiation. They put forth their best offer quite early in the negotiations.
I think both sides usually begin at a slow pace saying, let us not go around the clock this time. Let's get all our stuff out.
But as the clock runs, the bargaining volleys between management and labor. The mediator tries to urge an early settlement. And newsmen try to find out what's happening behind the locked doors of the negotiations.
Now, the mediator has to satisfy these normal inquiries from the press. On the other hand, he has an obligation to the parties who are bargaining in a representative capacity. You gain the confidence of the parties by not doing anything or saying anything, particularly to the press, which will impair the bargaining position of either side. By making a premature disclosure of a change in their bargaining position. As the deadline of a contract expiration approaches, and the prospect therefore increases that there might be a strike or a lockout, the pressure goes up and the tension increases. And while the same people are in the room talking, and they may talk right up till the very last moment, the tension heightens so you can practically cut it. And this is where the role of the strike or lockout comes to play in negotiations. I have said that the prospect of a strike or lockout is essential to the bargaining process. This is not merely a right of labor. In fact, it's a right of management as well, because the pressure is a two-way pressure. In some instances, it might even be far more severe on the workers than it is on the management.
I must disagree most vehemently with Mr. Keel. It's been my experience that the prospect of a strike, the threat of a strike, destroys the bargaining process as a means of arriving at a solution which would be looked upon by an objective person as fair and reasonable. When there is a strike or the threat of a strike, the minds of the so-called collective bargainers must turn to the question, can I lick him or can he lick me? That's the test there. It has nothing to do with whether one side or the other believes there is merit in the other's argument.
Sometimes the clock runs out before labor and management can get together. If the deadline beats the new contract, the union may call a strike.
A strike is the withdrawal of the individual from doing his job. He's at the end of his rope and he can't convince his boss that what he needs and what the boss can give is the right thing. And so he has no place left to go in the persuasion process but to withdraw his work. And so he goes on strike.
I don't want to seem cynical, but I think perhaps today there are two purposes for a strike. And here I refer to a strike called by the union leaders, an authorized strike. The first purpose is to get additional benefits out of the bargaining process. And I might add here, perhaps rather cynically, irrespective of the merits of the case. The second purpose is to let the membership get off its chest grievances or grudges against the company which have been built up over the years, justifiably or unjustifiably.
Now, the interesting thing is that once the strike takes place, there is a kind of a psychological letdown. The tension is removed momentarily because the decision has been made and the strike is on. And from that point forward, it becomes a question of how heavy the pressures will be on both sides. And usually for the first day or two or even week, the parties deliberately withdraw in order to assess the relative positions they're in and to get a feel of how severe the strike pressures are on the workers or on the company.
The pressures can be very severe. Workers can lose weeks or months of salary. Businesses can lose fortunes, their place in the market. Sometimes they've been driven to bankruptcy. And the pressure of a strike can be even more severe during walk-offs by public employees, such as teachers, transit workers, policemen.
Their boss, the government, does not exist to make money, but to render services to the public generally. And therefore, there has been consideration from time to time on about limitations on the prospect of a strike. I think it is wrong categorically to say that in all instances, the desirability of protecting the public against the consequences of a strike outweigh the desirability of having collective bargaining. But I also recognize that there may be circumstances in which the desirability of protecting the public does in fact outweigh the desirability of collective bargaining. The most obvious examples in the case of public employment are those of police and firemen.
To the average citizen, a strike of police and firemen would be disastrous. Chaos and destruction might result. But as labor leaders see it,
Well, when you go into the public sector and get confronted with the question, should public or governmental employees have a right to strike, the answer is yes, because we're back to rights. Can the individual be protected while protesting some abominable condition? And the answer is yes. That we should preserve in America for all Americans. Now, public employees are just ordinary people working for a living, with families, needing a job. And when conditions get so terrible that they say, I can't stand this no longer, I don't want to stand it no longer, as did the teachers in many places, then when they say, I'm withdrawing my labor, I'm going on strike, they certainly should have the right to do that. Now, when the garbage men of New York City got to the point where they could no longer take it, they went on strike. And there's no question about the fact that the people of New York City, confronted with a pileup of so much of their garbage for a week or 10 days, they kind of wondered, I'm sure, didn't their health and didn't their welfare mean something?
The people of New York did wonder, just as victims of public employees' strikes have wondered all across the country. Do workers have a responsibility to the public? Is there no other means of persuasion? Can workers be permitted to tie up shipping and production, to damage the nation's economy?
I think at one time the strike played a very great part and a proper part in the development of the American Labor Union, which has a real place in our society and had a very real place in our society. I think that today the unions have grown in stature and in power to a point where they're at least equal to managements and superior in power to most managements. And I think that we must substitute for the strike the logical, peaceful resolution of labor disputes. And I think that can be done only by furnishing to the parties some terminal process, some decision-making process to be used in the event that the parties are unable to reach agreement in the collective bargaining process. I am firmly convinced that if this industrial democracy of ours is to survive, we must substitute that sort of process for these nationwide crippling strikes which damage our economy irreparably.
What Everett Goulart suggests is compulsory arbitration, a legal method of requiring both parties to submit to a neutral third party who would then bring their demands together.
Well, compulsory arbitration, as the very term would suggest, compulsion. That's alien to what we try to keep as broad as possible in the United States, freedom of choice. And here comes the third party between two disputants that neither of them want to resolve their case. And he resolves it and then he leaves. But what does he leave? He leaves two parties with the same problems because they have not been able to get together. So compulsory arbitration is absolute nonsense. That's trying to buy a false peace while establishing all of the elements of continuous warfare.
Organized labor, and many others, may not respond warmly to the idea of compulsory arbitration. Yet, as Goulart points out, it may be the only alternative to crippling strikes.
As long as we have unions and the present system of collective bargaining, it's almost inevitable that there are going to be strikes to satisfy the membership. And that's where the system breaks down now. Only we need unions, or we need entities to discharge the proper function of a union, which is to obtain proper working conditions for the men they represent. The unions play a real part in this whole economy of ours with the arbitration process present. The job of the union then would be to present properly the demands of the workers, first over the bargaining table and if necessary before an arbitrator. So the union has a great place in our economy today and in our economy in the future, even with arbitration as the way of life or labor courts as the way of life.
The place of the union in our economy also depends upon the solution of problems within the labor movement. Membership has tapered off since the 1955 merger of the AFL and CIO. A smaller proportion of the working force is joining unions. A large part of the labor force is young, below the age of 30, and making different demands than the older workers. And political differences within the unions have created bitter internal splits. In addition, there are more office workers in the labor force, white-collar or professional people, than blue-collar or factory workers today. Many of these workers have already organized into union-like groups called professional associations, which function exactly like unions. Experts agree that this trend will continue. And then what? Can we expect more stalemates at the bargaining table and more strikes? Everett Goulard points out that the American labor movement rose out of a real need. He cites the situation during the 1930s.
Managements were doing their best, not to recognize unions as a representative of their employees. They would have much preferred back then to set the terms and working conditions of their employees themselves. And as a practical matter, the balance of power between management and an individual employee was non-existent. It was a complete imbalance. So that unions had a real place in substituting concerted power for the impotence of the individual. So I say that today, the positions being almost reversed, you find the same situation. I don't think labor leaders are bad men or management leaders are bad men. It's just human nature to exercise your power to some degree, and perhaps in some cases to an unwarranted degree. And I think that it's the opinion of many people today, and not just management representatives, that these powerful labor leaders, these powerful groups of organized people are using their power to an unwarranted degree.
Goulard's point of view is part of the controversy surrounding the labor movement today. Some people think that unions have distorted the ideals of the original movement. Others think that unions still have more to accomplish. No matter which side of the bargaining table you support, it is essential for the future that both sides' objectives, needs, and shortcomings be understood by the public. Because rightly or wrongly, the American public, the American consumer, remains in the middle.
Don't scab for the bosses, don't listen to their lies. Us poor folks haven't got a chance unless we organize. Which side are you on? Which side are you on?